So Renault comes knocking. What kind of a company? What is Renault all about at the time? What year is this, and what is the Renault corporate culture all about?
Good question.
Nick, you're probably best placed here.
Yeah, great question. So the year is 1997 when Renault comes knocking. Renault in France is an iconic company. Partly, well, first of all, you see Renaults absolutely everywhere. Like if I look outside of my street, there's a ton of Renaults on that street. So it's a bit like, I guess, GM, Ford, or whatever in the US. But also, it's got this amazing history where Louis Renault, who was the head of the company during the Second World War, got accused of collaborating with the Nazis, then died in jail, and so the whole company was nationalized. And so for many, many years, it's the property of the state. And it's not a for-profit company. Doesn't matter. It's not even called a company, actually. It's called a régie, which is like a kind of special word to describe what Renault does. And what Renault does is essentially make cars for the working classes, right? So you need cheap vehicles, and you need the working classes to be able to afford them. And whether or not they make a profit is immaterial, right? And so this begins to change kind of in the 90s, where Ghosn's predecessor Louis Schweitzer comes in, and he starts to tackle some of the more unproductive factories, some of the kind of he does want Renault to become a normal company. He wants them to expand around the world. He wants to make a profit. I mean, the joke at the time in France was that you kind of paid for a car twice. You paid at the dealership and you paid in your income taxes. Schweitzer wants to put an end to this, and thus this is why he.
Did they make good cars? Did they? Was it a quality product?
I mean, I don't think it was a bad product for the French market. Yeah, they make good cars. The problem is they cost way too much to make, right? And so you're not turning a profit. And as I say, for many years that's fine as long as the state bankrolls you. But there comes a time when they decide to privatize it, and that's no longer fine. And so. Schweitzer is very good at what certain things. Like, for example, he's good strategically. He can think about which markets he wants to go into. He's very good at schmoozing in France with the political classes, the establishment, which is very important here. But he's not so good at cutting costs. And so that's where he gets Carlos Ghosn. That he knows that Ghosn by this stage is getting a burgeoning reputation as a highly impressive cost cutter. He's 42 years old. And so that's why Schweitzer decides to hire him. And they're an extremely weird couple. Schweitzer's this kind of tall guy who's like, I think his dad was an ambassador, and he's, very smooth. And Ghosn is this kind of short, obviously guy from Lebanon, hard charging, like fire and ice, completely different. But they make a great team, actually. And Ghosn does great work at Renault. I mean, if I can go into just something quickly that he starts to do at Renault. At the time, Schweitzer decided that to break even within a few years, they needed to cut costs by 3,000 francs per car. And Ghosn just comes in, tears this up and says, no, actually, we're going to do 8,000 francs. We're going to call it the 20 billion plan, and we're going to go way further than what you've been thinking you can do. And he's like, and I want to shut 3 plants. I would tell you to shut 3 plants. Big in France to shut 3 plants. In the end, Schweitzer shuts 1, and that earns Ghosn the nickname Le Cost Killer, because there's a huge...
And not even in France, right?
And not even in France, the plant's in Belgium. But still, there's a huge hoo-ha in the press. And so, Ghosn gets to work cutting costs at Renault.
How does it play? Do people see his value, or are they wary of him? And when does it become apparent that this is the guy?
I mean, I think people are wary of him in France, because I think people are wary of executives in general, particularly foreign executives, and particularly executives who come in and just slash costs, which is essentially... That was Ghosn's job. Like, it was to come in and slash costs. So I think people at this stage are wary of him. The press, it's kind of like, it's his first time really being in the press, right? And so they're kind of having fun with this cost killer character. But very quickly, it kind of works. He delivers or he and his lieutenant. So he starts to like promote kind of young managers throughout the company, give them more power, and they manage to deliver, and they manage to build this pile of cash. And Renault is actually financially very, very healthy for once, right? I mean, this is not a usual state of affairs. So it's like share price is going up, profits are going up. Everyone's pretty impressed.
So how does he become the boss? And where does the idea to pair up with Nissan come?
Well, I mean, look, you got to go back and remember that, like, this was a time of massive automotive consolidation. I mean, if anybody of a certain age remembers the big Daimler-Chrysler merger, right? And that kicked off a bunch of things. I mean, Ford was buying up foreign car companies, and everybody was going abroad looking for car companies to buy. Interestingly, there's a bit of automotive history that's worth noting that, you know, Japanese car makers like Nissan made a big name for themselves, particularly in the US in like the 1970s during the huge gas price crisis there. But by the time we get to the late 90s, I mean, the roles have kind of reversed, where US car makers are strong again. And they're the ones with the deep pockets, and the Japanese car makers and Asian car makers in general are really struggling. So Schweitzer has a ton of cash. He's looking for acquisitions himself. He tried to go after Volvo unsuccessfully, and he's still got this cash burning a hole in his pockets. And they start looking at a host of Japanese car makers who, like I said, are now struggling after, you know, several decades of success. And they zero in on a couple of car makers, but Nissan being the sort of number one target, because it was, frankly speaking, a basket case. You know, they had an incredible engineering. It was just the weirdest thing about Nissan at the time is that they had some of the best, you know, sort of engine and transmission engineers. And, you know, sort of anybody who drove, you know, a Nissan car would rave about its performance because they were just frankly over-engineered. You know, they pumped everything they had into sort of how these cars perform, but they look like crap. You know, they were just sort of like understyled, you know, dated, you know, and they weren't really selling the cars that at the time American car makers wanted to buy. It was just a sort of, their priorities were upside down, and they dug themselves a massive $20 billion hole worth of debt, financed through some lax bank loans during what they called the bubble era in Japan, a period of rapid growth in the post-war era, which was, you know, rapidly drawing to a close, where they had a recession and then the credit markets dried up, and suddenly Nissan found its sort of tap of easy credit drying up at the worst possible time. So they were desperate. And that's what they sort of zeroed in on, because Renault under Schweitzer, you know, as Nick talked about, was privatizing, but, you know, in a time of increasing globalization, you know, Renault was deeply aware of the fact that they were a European car maker, but really a French car maker, right? There was a limit to how far they could grow. And especially when Daimler Chrysler happened, you're suddenly surrounded by these automotive giants that have scale that you'll never achieve. And the fear was that these automotive giants would just eat up your market share, and that you would just be dried up.
So Nissan is a very proud Japanese company, and they have many suitors.
Yes.
And Renault isn't the most prestigious global auto brand, but that's who ends up being their lifeline. How do these two companies compare, and how does nationalism or national pride, I should say, play into to the success or lack thereof of a partnership in this case?
So Renault ends up winning the right to buy a roughly 1/3 stake in Nissan, almost by process of elimination. So Renault starts the negotiations to do a tie-up to buy a stake in Nissan, and pretty soon afterwards, Daimler Chrysler, who was incredibly aggressive in their expansion, not just stopping at Chrysler, also joined the bidding war, and Renault suddenly found itself as a very distant second place in that negotiation, where, you know, Nissan, again, as I mentioned, you know, very proud of their technical expertise, you know, looked over at Daimler and said, well, yeah, we'd love to work with the Mercedes engineers. And nobody particularly wanted to work with Renault. Renault had cash, and that was about the only appeal in that situation. So it wasn't until Daimler dropped out of the negotiations and Renault was the last one standing at the altar that the deal went through.